My name is David Evans, Senior. I'm Vice President of Nelson Company, and Nelson Company is in Oviedo, Florida. We're a citrus and historically also a celery grower, and more recently, commercial real estate.
All right, David. The Florida Citrus Hall of Fame not only inducts people that are deserving, but we're on a mission to tell the story of Florida citrus. And one of our outreach efforts is what we're doing now is oral histories. And we're going out and talking to people. We want to capture untold stories. A lot of stuff is in literature, you know, the scientific literature is there, trade journals and so forth, minutes of associations. But the real story of Florida citrus is individuals and what's happened within their families. And so we've got some really great things on tape. And today we're gonna tell your story, and we're gonna go a little bit into the story of citrus here in this area in Oviedo. So my goal is to extract from you information and the history and some of the facts that make citrus interesting.
Okay.
Now, I want to start with your grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, James Hiram Lee.
Well, I don't know him, so we'll go for him. What I did, I did my homework, your grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Wheeler,
Senior.
is in the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame.
Correct.
And so there's a write-up in there about him and the history. So we'll go back one generation before that to your great-grandfather and tell me about him, and then we'll move through the family.
James Hiram Lee came to Oviedo in the early 1870s. He came, we think, by ox cart from South Georgia. He came to Oviedo after the Civil War, as did many people, into the interior of Florida. We know that he came and he married Laura Barnett Lee, or Laura Barnett, and they had 11 children. At the same time, they also had many people from upstate New York who during the severe winters would come to down the St. Johns River. They and their friends would rent a paddle boat, and they would cruise back and forth on the St. Johns, hunting and fishing and just enjoying the Florida weather. And eventually they stopped at Oviedo, which was the last navigable portion of the St. Johns River other than Geneva. And there were two wharfs on Lake Jessup, Celery's Wharf and White's Wharf. So they stopped and eventually settled here. It was called the Lake Jessup Settlement. They started growing citrus and other crops. And James Hiram Lee was a grower for many of the northern people who came down and settled in the Oviedo area. And so he actually started growing citrus in Oviedo in the 1870s. Interestingly enough, we had a lady here in Oviedo, Karen Jacobs, who went to the Jacksonville Times-Union, which was at that time, and I think maybe still is, the newspaper of record for the state of Florida. And every community had a correspondent. And so the correspondent would send the community news to Jacksonville. It would be printed in the paper. So we know from the archives of the Jacksonville Times-Union that in the 1880s, there were between 30 and 50,000 boxes of citrus being grown in the Oviedo area, being shipped to the northern markets. Started off going back by paddle wheeler up the St. Johns River to Jacksonville, packet steamers then to New York or other markets. That was until the freeze of December 1894 and February of 1895. And then there was a hiatus in there till the citrus. A lot of people left, but the few that stayed brought the citrus groves back. In the archives, we know that there was, in one instance, a 100-acre citrus grove in the Oviedo area prior to the 1894-95 freeze. So my great-grandfather, James Hiram Lee, was involved in the cultivation and also the growing and marketing of citrus before my grandfather Wheeler. And
Now, when reading the information about your grandfather Wheeler, he didn't start in the citrus business, but he got into it as he grew. He was born in Dade City, right?
yes, that's correct. His father was a sawmill operator, and his father on the Wheeler side, my great-grandfather on the Wheeler side, was a sawmill operator in Dade City, and my great-grandfather actually died in Dade City. And my uncle, John Lawton, went to Dade City and brought my grandfather back to Oviedo. And as I think in his early teens, and taught my grandfather to be a telegrapher. And my grandfather Wheeler became a railroad telegrapher, and he was actually in the 1895 freeze actually was a telegrapher for the railroad, and sent some of the early messages to the northern markets that this catastrophic freeze had happened, and there would not be any fruit for a significant period of time. My grandfather Wheeler actually married George Lee, who was one of the daughters of James Hiram Lee. So that was the connection between James Hiram Lee and B.F. Wheeler Sr.
So if you so from there, then Benjamin Franklin Wheeler, as the records go in the Hall of Fame, bought a frozen out grove, and embarked on a reclamation project to bring that grove back, and did a lot of the work himself, and actually was credited with being one of the early growers to actually bud trees. And so he would grafted trees, and you can almost picture him out there now after work in that grove and spending hours and cultivating sprouts and budding that sprout and looking after that young tree and everything else.
So in some of the messages sent to the northern markets, he noted that there was a citrus growing area in East Orange County around the south and east shore of Lake Pickett, which is about 5 miles due east of the University of Central Florida. And he noticed that the citrus in that grove was not killed to the ground. And so his personal goal in life was to own that property, which he eventually wound up acquiring. And once he acquired it, he would leave on Sunday. He'd leave Oviedo on a Sunday evening with his crews and his mule cart, and go to East Orange County to this property, and they would spend the week out there clearing the property. And they would clear it. The workers would actually bid on clearing certain laid off sections of land. I think it was like 50 by 50. They would bid on what they would clear the land for, and they eventually cleared that 11 and 15. I think maybe eventually it was 1,400 acres, and he planted it. And one of his very valued employees was actually credited with bringing the Temple orange from the islands. And Nelson Company was a very large Temple grower for years. Our specialty was Temples and Orlando Tangelos, along with things like the Pope Summer and other unusual early varieties. So and because he was also a railroad agent, they could travel, so he would visit the northern markets, and eventually he acquired the packing house of the Nelson brothers, who built the packing house here in Oviedo in the 1880s, early 1880s. And he acquired that packing house by becoming a junior partner, and then eventually buying them out. So by the early 1900s, he had a packing house, and he was a significant orange grower and he eventually even went into to celery growing. And it's that's eventually by the 1820s. Again, Oviedo was shipping significant amounts of citrus to the northern markets. At this time, though, it was by railroad. Oviedo's really fortunate in that we have two railroad lines, or had two railroad lines. One, the Atlantic Seaboard, and the other, the Seaboard Coastline. Both came into Oviedo. So one came from Orlando, the other came from Sanford. So it provided quite an excellent way to expedite the shipment of citrus.
So your family then was involved with Nelson, and therefore then I think your grandfather changed it to Nelson and Company from Nelson Brothers.
That's
and
correct.
So he was the principal owner of Nelson and Company,
Right.
and had a packing house, and then eventually Wheeler Fertilizer. He got in the fertilizer business. I was reading that he was a big proponent of dolomite and was one of the few that included dolomite as a filler. Most fertilizer companies put sand in there, but he would put dolomite as an economical source of magnesium and calcium for the groves. So
Very, very difficult for those early farmers, very difficult for them to acquire nutrients for agricultural production. So he early on decided that they needed a fertilizer plant. So he constructed a fertilizer plant and hired a formulator and a manager and started blending fertilizers. And because we were sitting on two railroad lines, he was able to bring in bulk materials to manufacture and blend fertilizers. And interestingly enough, when I was a child in the 50s, I was born in 1948, I remember that we were actually shipping truckloads of bagged fertilizer to the Glades. I remember one time my father came in and said, why don't you come with me? And we drove down to East Orange County, or East Osceola County. One of our trucks had hit a cow down there, and this bagged fertilizer was all over the road, and we had sent a crew down there to pick the fertilizer up, put it back on the truck. And but this was somewhere around where Van Conley's Grove is today, the Beck Brothers Grove is today. So interestingly enough, that fertilizer company blended and shipped fertilizer all over most of Central Florida, as far as the Glades.
So you were introduced into citrus as a young man, as a boy. You know, I get these stories, David, and sometimes I really feel bad because I grew up in the city and I missed out on all that character building that you guys that grew up in the industry had. I mean, like loading fertilizer onto trucks, hoeing trees, and doing all this kind of wonderful stuff. Was that part of your childhood?
My father grew up in a children's home in Illinois, and because my grandfather Wheeler was a railroad agent, my mother could travel, so she wound up going to graduate school in Chicago, Northwestern University, and met my father in Chicago. And he was getting his accounting degree at Northwestern Night School and working for an accounting firm of Bauman and Finney. And after the World War II, when he got back from Europe, he came to Oviedo. And having grown up, he wanted to actually be a doctor, went to Ohio State in the early 30s and couldn't finish because the bank where his money was deposited failed, and so he had to drop out and wound up getting to go back to school at night school. But he was a very I won't say driven man. He was a very ambitious individual, and I still remember he took us to the Belknap hardware store here in Oviedo. Three of my brothers, I have three brothers. My oldest brother is Wes, who was born before World War II. Then Arthur, who was born after World War II in 1947. I was born in 1948. My youngest brother Charles was born in 1950. My father took Arthur myself and Charles, we went to the hardware store, and he bought each one of us a grubbing hoe. And I still remember we sat on the curb, and he took his knife out and put our initials in the wooden handle of the hoe. He then took us to a grove here in town in Oviedo, where my grandmother's home is, my mother's home now. But he said, I want you to start here. He said, I want you to get on your bicycles every morning right over here. And he said, I want you to start here. And he said, I want every tree hoed out to the drip line, beyond the drip line. And he said, when you get through on the other end of the grove, he said, at the end of the summer, he said, I'll give you a nickel a tree. So that was the first introduction. Then every holiday and every summer, we had to work. We either worked in the packing house, loading box cars. At that time, they had refrigerated box cars, and they were icing them through the top bunkers. There were ice plants in most ag towns, and they bring these 500-pound blocks of ice, chip them up, put them in a bunker on top of the tree, and we loaded rail cars with 90-pound boxes of oranges during high school. We didn't have any holidays off. And then the summers, we generally had to take our hoe and walk ahead of a water truck building rings while they watered. They came behind and watered young trees. And so my father believed in the work ethic. And in fact, when my brothers and I all got home from college one year, I still remember after finals, we were all sleeping in, and he came home from the office, and he said, he went into each room and threw back the covers, and he said, get up, get dressed, shave. We're not going to have any lazy boys in this family. And so we had to get up and go, and he said, go find something to do. So he instilled a work ethic in us that I still think, today I'm 72 and still coming to the office every morning, as are my other brothers. And so deeply instilled this work ethic. So does that answer your question?
It does. So you grew up in Oviedo. What other citrus families or ag families were here? First of all, Rex Clontz is in here, but Rex was a Lee, right? So
Rex's grandfather, Charles Simeon Lee, is my grandmother's younger brother, and so Rex's mother, Thelma Clontz, married Rex Clontz, and then Rex is the oldest of their 5 children, so that'd be Rex Clontz. So Rex is a cousin, and we lived right down the road from each other. I can remember his father getting up early every morning, 4 or 5 o'clock, and driving to Apopka from Oviedo, because that's where they were farming at that time. They were farming they were farming celery, corn, carrots, I think some spinach. So Rex Clontz Sr. would drive to Apopka every morning, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and spend the day over there, and they'd come home.
Yeah, Rex started off as a vegetable farmer. They had some land over here at Black Hammock.
Correct.
Lake Jessup as well, but when the Water Management District purchased the vegetable land, then Rex bought some citrus groves and so forth. Mm-hmm. How many packing houses were there in Oviedo besides Nelson and Company?
There was Nelson Company, Lake Charm Fruit Company. Those were still in existence in the 50s and 60s. Prior to that, there were numerous packing houses scattered all over Black Hammock or Oviedo. Smaller packing houses, because of every grower put up his own packing shed, and the railroad lines and the trunk lines ran all over this country. Wherever there was a shed, a packing shed, they put a railroad line to it. So I can't tell you how many packing sheds there were, but probably a dozen or more.
Yeah, there were a lot of these kind of functioned almost as gift fruit houses do now. They cultivated and had a rather targeted market, and so they packed their fruit and shipped it to somebody that they knew or had dealt with. And after a while, it got to the point where you know, I'm packing in my shed, and it's getting to be a real chore. But Nelson and Company downtown has got a big packing house,
Right.
and I can almost sell them my fruit for as much as I'm getting for it, and I'm working myself to death doing this. And so Nelson would then start consolidating and getting a lot of these smaller ones
Right.
together. And
Eventually, prior to the 1993 freeze, Nelson Company was handling about 1,200,000 to 1,300,000 boxes of fruit, and a lot of that was going through the packing house. And of course, there's a conversion ratio there between a field box and a packed box. But there were about 1,300,000 boxes coming. Nelson Company, the family was handling prior to the 1983 freeze. Interestingly enough, and we've already talked about the St. Johns River being the transportation mode for back in the 1800s. And when the railroads came to Florida in the 1880s, it changed the whole dynamic of agriculture in Florida. One of the things that I remember, there was also in Oviedo a celery packing house. Duda had a celery packing house at their office out in Slavia, and some of the growers, the celery growers here in Oviedo had a celery, they call them a pre-cooler, a celery pre-cooler, and that was also on the railroad tracks. And so at one time between Sanford and Oviedo, there was more celery grown and shipped than anywhere else in the world. You had Sanford, you had the Chase and Company family, which is now Sunnyland, and then you had numerous growers, celery growers here in Oviedo. Celery was making $5 a crate in the early 1900s. Citrus was making, we have some records that show that we were getting $9 a box for tangerines prior to 1900, $5 a box across the board for most oranges. And so anyone who knows how to future value a dollar can figure out what that would be worth in today's dollars, purchasing power. Significant money, significant.
And I, from what little I could read, citrus growers that got wiped out in the freeze and needed to generate some cash to get back into business would start growing celery, and probably would look at the land that had higher organic matter, the soil that could produce a good celery crop, and they were able to generate some cash quickly with the celery, and then slowly get back into the citrus business.
Yes, and again, we have records that show that in the early 1900s, people were clearing $2,000 an acre on celery. Again, a very significant amount of money, which explains how they could go into a hardwood hammock swamp and clear the cypress trees, clear the elms, clear the hickory, clear the gum, and then start growing celery. And eventually they also put in, this whole area around Oviedo has artesian wells. So they would put in wells, and then they would go in and put in tile lines, header pots, vertical concrete tubes, and I think it was like every 20 or 30 feet. Then they would run a 4-inch terracotta tile underground drain bedded in cypress sawdust, because cypress sawdust wouldn't rot, and that's how they underground watered or irrigated these celery crops. They would drain them, and they could water them using artesian wells and these terracotta underground pipelines.
Now, I read where your grandfather was a firm believer in that, and actually a lot of the groves around here had tile drains in it, and we think that those people down there at Southwest Florida were the first to get into water management, but he realized early on that the amount of fruit you produced on top of the ground was highly dependent upon the volume of roots that you had underneath the ground.
That's correct.
And by draining that excess water off, you could gain a foot or two of rooting depth. It was all the difference in the world between having a decent crop and having a really good crop of fruit on the trees.
Well, that's correct, John. Many of our early grows were bedded, 2-row beds with perimeter ditching and discharge pumps.
I remember when you said that was start that conversation.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, David, I think that, we think of citrus in this part of the state as being on deep, well-drained, sandy soils. That ridge runs from Leesburg to Lake Placid, but we're off the ridge over here generally, and this is heavier soil, which was conducive to growing celery. But if you were going to grow citrus, you had to take care of water management one way or the other, and it wasn't feasible here to do bedded grows too much. I mean, it was easy. Was it easier to tile it, or they just didn't want to lose land by putting up beds? Are there bedded grows around?
Well, the soil types here are oak hickory hammocks with flooded, intermittent flooded lateral zones. We started off back in the early 50s bedding groves and putting in perimeter ditches with throw-out pumps. And what they would also do is go down the middle of the bed and trench in the terracotta drain tiles to drain the middle of the bed that the swell didn't take off the surface water. Eventually, when the ABS slotted pipe with a sock, well, actually it started off ABS pipe, and we actually had a laser ditcher, a laser-driven ditch witch that we would use to put ABS pipe into the top of a bed of a grove. And then we later went to ABS pipe in a sock, but we were using underground drains going back into the 20s and the 30s, which would give us more root zone, which of course increased the height of the tree because we're on flat woods. This is considered flatwood soil. Water table is 42 to 48 inches.
So this is a little bit bigger challenge growing citrus here than it would be to grow in a well-drained, sandy soil environment.
So, well, when John, and to that point, the interesting thing is historically we've always had much higher pound solids. It would not, on juice oranges, it would not be unusual for us at the end of the season to have a Lynch oranges running 7.8 to 8 to 8.1, 8.2 pounds of solids.
But you weren't growing rough lemon rootstock over here, were you?
No, we were growing sour orange and typically until Tristasia came, and then we went to Clio, or actually we had one Clio grove, one Clio Valencia grove that we grew strictly for storage fruit because the fruit would hang on the tree longer and had higher acid, which you wanted for storage fruit, and we put tens of thousands of boxes into summer storage and in cold storage to sell into the later markets in late July, August, and September. But to your point, yes, we were on sour orange mainly.
Well, that leads us into the next segment of the industry. If you're growing sour root trees and you got high solids, you're ideal for the processing market. So I understand that your grandfather was organized a lot of growers and was instrumental in getting and B&W packing a processing plant over in Groveland. So that was the next step when it got to the point of processing was in the state. Did he organize growers in this area with some sort of an association, or how was that involvement with B&W, or he just went to B&W and became actively involved in fruit?
Going back even further, he was buying tangerines out of Osceola County. He was also buying other fruit crops. After my father and my uncle Frank Wheeler came back after World War II, they also became quite active in the business, and they would buy fruit crops to pack and also to ship to B&W Citrus.
So Nelson and Company not only, well, were they all a cash buyer? Did they buy all the fruit, or did they have participants with Nelson?
We did both. We had cash. We bought for cash, and we also had pools. We also had fresh fruit pools, because many of the family members had their own personal groves, and so the only equitable way to handle that was to pool the fruit, all the fruit, because depending on when it was picked, we know that market values fluctuate, and so all the fruit that was either outside purchase or family, it was pooled, and then they became original members and owners in B&W Concentrate in Groveland, and we would ship every evening. We would have we called them trains of trucks heading out of Oviedo through downtown Orlando, Highway 50, Colonial, through Orlando to Groveland, and then when the East-West Expressway came in, then they started shipping on the East-West Expressway, cross town, hit Highway 50, and then go on to Groveland, Claremont and Groveland. So
Nelson and Company ought to own an interest in the Central Florida Parkway Association. There, so much food that you shipped across there. This wasn't just elimination. This was
bulk citrus, early and mids, and Valencias, and we always tended to be 50-50 early and mids to Valencias, which was very advantageous. Whenever you were a member of a juice co-op, they wanted the Valencias for the color and for the bricks, and so they could blend for a more acceptable product. So yes, we were early members of B&W, and my Uncle Frank Wheeler actually was chairman of the board of B&W for years, and he would always bring home some frozen concentrate, and we had a juice machine in the office that we always had fresh orange juice, like I'm assuming all major citrus growers were that.
We're doing that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, David, as we gather these stories, I'm actually amazed at how similar a lot of the stories are, and also the fact that there are families like yours that are in all these towns that have citrus,
Right.
and folks don't appreciate the fact that these families not only had the citrus business, but they were pillars in the community. I remember your great-grandfather was one of the founders of the Baptist church here,
Right.
but the families supported the church,
Right.
all the benevolent organizations
Right.
there, but more importantly, they functioned as a huge family for the citizens in the community, because running a packet house, in order to do that, you employed a lot of ladies, and that was mostly second income for those families.
Right.
The packing houses were perfect because they didn't start running until after school started.
Right.
They quit before school was over with, and so mom could be here packing fruit, get home in time to fix up or look after the children, and be there during the summer,
Right.
which was absolutely perfect. But your family, and like I said, these families all over the citrus area were integral in the communities and in the lives of all those people that were involved.
So my great-grandfather, James Hiram Lee, at one point, Seminole County, Oviedo is in Seminole County now, but at one time, Seminole County and Orange County were one county. And James Hiram Lee, my great-grandfather, was actually an Orange County commissioner. And actually, he was chairman of the Orange County Commission prior to the 1900s. My grandfather Wheeler was also a county commissioner. My father, John Evans, was actually chairman of the Seminole County School Board in the early 60s, and he and Doug Stenstrom and several other people in Sanford floated the first bond issue, and they built 7 schools, of which Oviedo High School is one of those schools. He was also instrumental. He was chairman of the school board also and integrated Seminole County schools. That was I'm sure tried his leadership abilities, but was actually at a birthday party here about 2 years ago, and was talking with a partner in the law firm of Stinstrom Davis McIntosh, Ken McIntosh, and he was at that time the county prosecuting attorney. And he said, "I still remember your dad being chairman of the Seminole County School Board," and they were talking about integration. And Judge Young, the federal judge in Orlando, had issued a busing order for Seminole County, and the school board was being questioned by people. And your dad said, "I'm colorblind. All I see are children that need to be educated." And he said, "This is something we need to do." And so, speaks to the leadership that and to the vision that people needed. James Hiram Lee was also one of the founding members of the Oviedo First United Methodist Church, and that church was founded in 1876. So he was one of the founding members. My grandfather Wheeler was a member of the Baptist Church. My Uncle Frank Wheeler was on the board of Stetson University for, 30 years. My father was chairman of the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association in the 60s and was chairman of the board right before Dennis Wedgeworth's father, George Wedgeworth. So yes, they were quite involved in the leadership, both in the community and also at the state association level.
It's fascinating these stories, and you're talking about your dad coming in and pulling back the covers and telling you kids to get out. I'm wondering if the next generation now, when you and I were growing up, you were working, I was outside playing, and now my grandkids are in front of a damn screen pushing buttons.
Yeah.
And so what's going to happen down the road, I don't know. But they certainly aren't getting the kind of character building that you and your brothers got.
Well, I think this is really the value of small agricultural communities, is that my brother Arthur, I went through Florida Southern. I got a business degree with a minor in horticulture, and I'd gone through ROTC, so I wound up being a first lieutenant flying helicopters in Vietnam. And when I got out of the service in 1974, came back to Oviedo, and so my brother at that time, Arthur, was already chairman of the Oviedo City Council. Oviedo was the first city in Seminole County. Seminole County was the first county in the state to implement the Florida Required Growth Management Plan. I followed my brother into the Oviedo City Council and became chairman, and we did the second 5-year update of the State Comprehensive Land Plan. So it's interesting that when you think about it, you have, John, to your point, I look at my friends across the citrus industry, across the ag industry, they're all leaders. They're all leaders. They're all involved. Hopefully, I've raised my children, and we've raised our children, Arthur and Charles and Wes, the same way we were raised. They had to pick up the shovel. They had the same rigorous experiences in following the water trucks and driving the tractors and disking and mowing. That's where you learn character. You learn character by getting up and going to work. And then I wanted my children, we wanted our children to have the same sense of accomplishment and the same sense of success that we've enjoyed, we wanted them to have that same sense, because it builds confidence, it builds character, it builds leadership, and that's really what it's all about.
They had a lot of good role models in the family to follow, didn't they? You know, and it's wonderful because that stays with them. My wife Catherine grew up on a dairy in Seminole County, out in Geneva, and I say this: as soon as she was able to tie her own shoes, she was expected to be at that dairy, whether it was milking cows, looking after calves, or whatever it was, and she rode the bus from Geneva to Seminole High School. And you take that trip now, it takes you half an hour. I don't know how long it took on the bus, but she knew that she better do her homework on the bus, because when she got off the bus, there were cows to take care of. Just like, and for you knew that you had responsibilities to do it. Well, you know,
we had 30 tangerine trees in the home I grew up in. We had 30 tangerine trees in our backyard. And my brothers and I, that was when the tangerines were ripe, that was our job, is to get the ladders and to get the one fuel box bins from the packing house, bring them to the house, and pick those trees and put them on the back of the pickup truck and take them back to the packing house and load them, because that paid the taxes. Those 30 tangerine trees paid the taxes. And that was our job every year.
Fantastic. Well, are there some characters that you can remember in Oviedo that you know, that not family members per se, but every town kind of had some folks that that were memorable, that were in agriculture? You know, you and I talked one time about a friend of mine that, not a friend, a guy that went to summer camp with me, Tommy Estes, that lived here in Oviedo, which is really kind of an interesting fact. Is I remember his house, it was a yellow brick house, and and whoever built that house built the exact same house in Sanford, because I drive by that house all the time. But there had to have been some people in Oviedo that were.
Right. Tom Estes is still alive. He's a friend of mine too. He lives in Sanford. His father was an extremely successful celery grower, great leader, died early. I think Tom was like 13 years old when his father passed away from a heart attack. But his father had built a pre-cooler, which Nelson Company eventually, after his father passed away, Nelson Company bought the pre-cooler, and that's where we ran our celery. So Tom's father was quite the entrepreneur. I don't know how old he was when he passed away, but maybe early 50s. But he had already been very successful in celery, had already bought a large ranch in East Seminole County, unfortunate, but those things happen in life. There are no guarantees. We're just thankful for every day that we're given. Jim Wilson came to Oviedo to grow celery, and I don't know the time frame, I assume the 20s or the 30s. His father had some of the original General Motors stock. Jim came and grew celery for a season or two, and for some reason or other wasn't a farmer and lost money, and he quit growing celery, but he still stayed here, and he would buy Mrs. Wilson a new Cadillac every year, and he'd buy a new pickup truck, and they didn't have any children, so he would come and get us on Saturday mornings, and we would go down and row the boat for him while he fished with his fly rod on the Econ. And I later learned that we were giving him a lot of free labor. He did give us lunch, but in retrospect, I'm not so sure it was a good trade, but we had good times. And we had Joe Linehart. Joe Linehart was an early celery grower. He eventually wound up growing mums. He was, in fact, he and his brother were great growers. He and his wife was actually a a professor at Rollins College and used to drive in, but he wore paydays, and sometimes he had a t-shirt on, sometimes he didn't. He always had a gold watch fob and a big railroad watch, and sometimes he shaved, sometimes he didn't, but we had a barber shop here in town, and when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my mother would let us come down and get our hair cut. We'd ride our bikes down. And so I was sitting in the barber shop one day, and Joe Leinhardt came in, and he had some beard on, and first thing he did is he took his pocket knife out and had a wet rock, and he started sharpening his knife, and Leon Olive, who was the barber, was shaving a man in the seat, and Joe Leinhardt reached over and grabbed me by the earlobe and said, "Leon, do you think I need to give this young man a shave?" And he had that knife, and it just terrified me. I went home and told my mother, and my mother came down and had a few words with Joe Leinhardt. My mother was a remarkable woman. She in her late teens, well, she was bright, and so she finished college like when she was 17, 18 years old, and then she went to Chicago to go to graduate school at Northwestern University, and she was a great inspiration and a thoughtful but intelligent lady, and she definitely was the lady. She was small, about 5'4", but very much the lady, and strong-willed, but soft and had a real soft touch. And she was with a few words. She was a speech and English. That was her degree. So she said every word has a meaning, and when you speak, think about what you're going to say and use the right words. And so we called it the Claire stare. When she gave you the stare, you knew that you were in trouble and you better straighten up, because then the next thing was she would dress you down in the nicest way. I mean, she just really had a way about her that, but I can only imagine what she told Joe Leinhardt. But he probably was very afraid of her.
Well, but he paid attention.
Oh, she got your...
But, and it's kind of interesting that your grandfather, though, Benjamin Franklin Wheeler, was uneducated in school, right?
Right.
And I read where he graduated, when he came down here in his late teens, he had managed to get through the 6th grade or something
Right.
like that. But,
Grandfather Wheeler did not finish school, and yet he was extremely bright individual, and he understood character. He could discern character in people, and he would hire people with a lot of character, but also people who had a work ethic, and then he would give them a responsibility, he would give them a job, and then he would let them run with that, and to see what they could do with their skills, their talents. And so he was uneducated, but interestingly enough, he and Grandmother Wheeler educated many of the children in Oviedo. They sent them to college because he again, just like my father, understood the value of education, and he understood that people can't break out of their socioeconomic circumstance unless they have the tools to do it. And so it's again getting back to the value of family businesses and communities and the networking that happens.
those that were successful, from what I've observed, people that were employees realized that they worked with
Right.
your grandfather, not for your grandfather.
Right.
And if you can impart that kind of feeling to employees,
Right.
productivity is there, allow someone to make some
Right.
mistakes, learn, create, move, and go ahead.
So it's been a very interesting journey, we had, prior to the 1983 freeze, we had 350 employees. Within 2 years, we were down to 50 employees. And my brother Arthur and I had the responsibility of furloughing most of these employees, because my Uncle Frank, my father had already died. My father had died unexpectedly in 1982, the year before the freeze. Uncle Frank had had a heart attack. And so Arthur and I wound up being the ones that furloughed these employees. And some of them had worked for us for 40 and 50 years. It was very difficult, but necessary. I mean, there was no, we'd gone from 2,000 plus acres of citrus back to 800 acres overnight. And the 800 acres was severely damaged, just like it was in the rest of Orange County, Lake County, Marion County. Just it was wiped out. Took us 20 years to make a profit again. But in that period of time, we transitioned from a strictly ag company into a commercial real estate with commercial properties. And
you had to, and that's how
right.
people survived. And from my observation, people in this area that survived the freezes, growers, were those growers that had not leveraged what they had and were not burdened with debt. You know, a spreadsheet's great, David, except when that line on the top that says income and that line on the top goes to zero. All the rest of those numbers just don't really make it, do they? And so,
No.
So you leverage money in this grove to buy another grove, and the freeze came, then you're in trouble. But those people who were conservative and
Right.
weren't heavily in debt, they could find ways to come out and survive.
Well, it's interesting that my father, again, very entrepreneurial. My oldest brother Wes found a grove in East Orange County. It was a 60-acre, half Valencia, half Hamlin grove, and it was owned by a lady in Jacksonville by the name of Carson. And Mrs. Carson's family was in what they call they were in the turpentine business. There's a term for it, naval store business. They were in the naval store business, and they were doing pulpwood, turpentine, all those pine tree related. And she had this 60 acres in East Orange County, and she wanted to sell it, so my brother just happened to find it, and so we bought it, and I think I was like 18 years old. And my dad said to the four of us, he said, I will guarantee the loan, but I'm not going to pay the loan. And so I was 18, my younger brother was, I think, 16, Arthur was like 19, and Wes was like 24. So we bought our first grove, 60-acre grove, and our father encouraged us to do it. So when I was in Vietnam, I was earning flight pay, and I was earning hazardous duty pay, and I was sending my paycheck home to pay the mortgage on that grove and to buy more grove. And so my brothers and I, we were buying groves all through the 70s. And it was interesting in that we bought that grove for, I think it was $3,200 an acre. And my uncle said, you can't pay $3,200 an acre for citrus groves in the late 60s, early 70s. And we said, well, we have to, because if we don't, somebody else will buy it. And so it's interesting how eventually we wound up paying $5,000 an acre in the 70s. And of course then the freezes came. But my father always said that if you could buy a grove and pay it off in 3 to 5 years, and then it was probably a pretty good deal, a pretty good investment. So it's, it's, interestingly enough, my observation is that in his generation, you own the asset, the grove, the timber, the ranch. But in my generation, our generation, I think you own the cash flow, because I've seen my friends who are attorneys or doctors, surgeons, dentists, they wound up buying the agricultural assets that the agricultural people couldn't hold on on those years, and they couldn't make money, and they were leveraged, to your point. So we always had to live below our means. If you're in agriculture, you always live below your means. Well, there were several boxes. You had a field box, which is, this is a field box. This is a miniature version of a field box. That was 90 pounds of oranges, 95 of tangerines, 85 of grapefruit.
And 1 in 3 fish bushels by volume.
Yeah, 1 in 3 fish bushels by volume. So that's a field box. In the packing house, you had a baby Bruce. You had you had a bunch of different standards that, depending on whether it was oranges, tangerines, or grapefruit, they used different size boxes. In the top of every packing house, you had a box room or box loft, and they would make up these wire-bound boxes. They would take wood veneer, generally soft hardwood like gum or gum or elm, and they would veneer it into a thin veneer, and then they would put wire inside of it, and it was called wire-bound. And most packing houses had a box room or a box loft, and they would build there would be a crew up there that would be building boxes as you had packers on the line packing the different sizes of fruit into the different boxes. And early on, they had ink stamps, and they would, on the side of the box, they would put the fruit size. So when it got to the northern markets and was sitting in the warehouse, in the auction, they could see the size of the fruit. We were really fortunate in that our premium label was White Rose, and White Rose historically always brought 50 cents to $1.25 more than most other label fruit. For the quality, we would grade very hard all the crops coming in that were going into the White Rose label. And so we also had another label, the Moonbeam label, which you see on a lot of publications. That was one of our other labels. And then we also had a Ben Franklin label. And generally the predominant color on the label told you whether it was the #1 grade or a 2nd grade or a 3rd grade. But our White Rose was always a #1 premium grade, and we never compromised on the fruit going into that box.
And those labels were blue.
Those labels were predominantly blue with a white rose on it. And so the crate room, the crate loft, it was generally up, because when they built the box, they would put it in a slide, and it would slide down to the packers below, and they would take it. Depending on what size fruit they were packing, they would put the stamp that put the size on it with it. Later we had machines label everything. So that was the packing shed. That was the Baby Bruce and the wire bound. And then later we went to cardboard, waxed. First of all, it started off as cardboard, printed cardboard, and then it went to a waxed cardboard.
And most of those cardboard cartons were 4 fish bushels, which basically is half of the field box. And
that's correct.
So when you talk about boxes, it can get confusing. And then when you go across the country, the California box is not the same as the Florida box. So you can't really, pardon the pun, apples and oranges, but a California box isn't the same as a Florida box. But
right.
Anyway, and we went to standards of weight when we went to processing, because processors pay you by weight, not by volume and solids. We could get into a whole class of grades and standards and packing and everything else. So it's you had to be sharp and know what was going on.
Absolutely.
Well, David, you have done a great job. One more question?
Yes, the names, how did you guys come up with the names, White Rose, Moonbeam, and Ben Franklin? What are the stories behind those, do you know?
I don't know. All I know is a White Rose label is a label that we've had is forever. And the moonbeam, I don't have any inkling where that came from. I have to assume that the Ben Franklin was a label that in honor of my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Wheeler. So Ben Franklin, I have to assume that was, and we had another one called a Maple Leaf, but again, it was not something that we packed very frequently. We did have another label. We actually had a Indian River label because some of our groves in east of the St. Johns River
Fallen district.
fell into the Indian River district, and so we had an Indian River label that we packed whenever we pull fruit from our Lake Harney Grove or our Volusia County groves.
Do you know what name that one was?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
See, back in those days, there were no marketing firms that had idea people to come up with these kind of things. And as you look at all the labels, you know,
Right.
some of them are pretty obvious. You know, they were named after somebody's dog. You know, the Simpsons have Roxy, and I don't know exactly which Simpson's dog was named Roxy, but obviously Mr. Simpson thought a lot of his dog if he put it on the label. And then, of course, there were a lot of children. Jennings Rao has his daughter Jennifer on there as Dolly, and kids were good. Sometimes it was great. I've been working with some labels on these sign deals, and there's the cutest label in Eustis of a little boy, and the label's Chubby. And I'm wondering, you know, if Chubby, when he got to be older, had a trouble with that name, but you know.
Probably. Yeah.
When you're a kid, you know, Dumpy is cute. But when Dumpy becomes CEO of Plymouth Citrus Growers, I wonder if in the board meetings they call him Dumpy or Elliot, you know. So when do you go from Johnny to John, right? You know, those kind of things. But,
well, it is interesting. My daughter, Kaylin Evans, Chat now, went to FSU and got her master's, and she wrote a paper about labels and labels as a form of marketing, and she referenced it as an art because that was her specialty, was art. She talked about label art for marketing, and she wrote a paper, and actually I guess it's somewhere up there in the at FSU in the archives. So
every graduate student thesis is there
Yeah.
in the department, filed someplace.
So I've got a copy of it somewhere, and it's interesting because she goes through all our labels and all our history and talks about that. And
there can be some great stories that, whether they're true or not, you know, about some, and none of the artists that did crate labels ever signed them. And so you don't know whether the story is really true that Norman Rockwell started by doing fruit and vegetable labels. It makes a good story or not. And how many of those artists became named or known artists, and how many were just, you know, were employed to do it. And you can also tell too, David, when you start looking at labels about some companies that really were taking an effort to get their particular labels. And there were others that just said, I'll take that one because they were standards, and they just put my name on the same thing. So you can see the same label with about 15 different company names on it.
It is interesting because we at one point had to defend our label as intellectual property. There was a White Rose store and the Northeast that sued us to claim that White Rose was their brand, and we said no. We went back and proved that we had been using it prior to their existence, and so we have defended our label. And the other thing is, Bill Lewin with Conley Fruit just sent me a text that he saw a White Rose label in a restaurant on I-95 somewhere. A Cracker Barrel restaurant had a White Rose label in the restaurant, and he sent me a picture of it. So it's interesting how it gets around. So,
Well, when they became collector's items, it was.
yeah.
I have one other question for you. Sales of your fruit. I mean, when you guys had 1.3 million boxes of fruit, who was your sales? How did you, yeah. Sales through the years, actually.
So when I was going through high school and college, our salesman was a man by the name of Irvin Flasher. Irvin was a phenomenal salesman. He and his family had come down from New York back in the 30s and 40s, and he had spent a lot of time in Sanford selling celery and other commodities to the northern markets, and we hired him. But Irvin was a phenomenal salesman. And then after he retired, my oldest brother Wes took up marketing and was responsible for marketing. And he handled all the marketing and had a lady that helped him, Mary Atkinson. Mary Atkinson's father was a citrus grower in Lake County. Lawrence Atkinson. And Mary was also a phenomenal salesman. And so we had a sales department, and they handled sales. We had.
So you weren't in a cooperative like Seal Sweet or anything.
No.
Lake Region also sold their fruit directly, and it was always a challenge. But you develop markets. I remember going over to Lake Region, and that marketing room was a madhouse, because you got to. I'm delivering 19 loads is going to Milwaukee, and 14 are going to here, and keeping up with what was going where, what grade they wanted, and so Wes would know these buyers, these in the chains up there, and if he had to move some grapefruit, he'd call and say, "Hey, I got a great deal on some white grapefruit for you," and you'd kind of.
Yeah. So, and Wes visited the northern markets frequently, because we sold into Toronto, we sold into Boston, New York, Hunts Point, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis. We sold into all those major markets, and interestingly enough, if the fruit arrived and the broker said, "Well, I'm going to have to put a discount on this because you've got some spoilage, you've got some discoloration, you've got some freeze." Wes would immediately get on a plane and fly up there and inspect it, because you better protect your own interest. But he would immediately be flying out to another.
After a while, you developed good relations, and people didn't realize that you were going to follow up. What's that got? Understand, but that was a real challenge, because a lot of the packing houses went the cooperative route because it wasn't quite as strenuous on them marketing. So that was a real challenge, and to be able to do that, it required a lot of hands-on work and a lot of developing personal relationships and everything else.
Yeah, it really is a. It's almost tragic that the freezes, as an outcome of the freezes and an outcome of greening, that we've lost this skill, we've lost this industry, we've lost the connections. It's because it really was really an amazing industry, and created a tremendous amount of wealth. One of the stories I tell is when I got out of service and came back and interviewed for a job with my father, he said, "What are you?" And I said, "I guess I'm a citrus and celery grower." And he said, "No, you're an asset manager." And so I turned around and said, "Well, Dad, why is a Yankee an accountant with an accounting firm in the Loop in Chicago? Why'd you come to Oviedo in 1945? He said, "Well, David, let me tell you a story." He said, "In 1947, I took your grandfather Wheeler to Christmas, and he said there was a 30,000 acre ranch for sale for $5 an acre. So for $150,000 in 1947, you could have bought a 30,000 acre ranch in Christmas." He said, "Your grandfather was not a cattleman, and he wasn't a timberman. He was a citrus grower and a celery grower, and he said, I took him down there and showed him that property 3 different times. He said he would not buy it because he also was a young businessman through the Depression. If he couldn't have a crop every year and be able to create an income every year, he was not going to buy it. So stepping forward, that's 1947. In 1962, they bought a ranch in East Orange County and paid $260 an acre for it. After the freezes in 1985, we sold that ranch for $5,000 an acre. Today, that property is worth probably, depending on entitlements and zoning, it's probably worth between $30,000 and $90,000 an acre. So you see the opportunity my father saw coming to Florida in 1945 as an accountant from Chicago in the Loop with a national accounting firm. He said he saw more opportunity in Central Florida than he did in Chicago. So and then when you think about the families in Florida who in the last 100 to 140 years have created the presence, I won't say the wealth, but the presence that they've created, it was through agriculture. And so I asked people, I said, so tell me, when I give you that story, tell me, was that appreciation or was that inflation? Was the escalation in value from $5 an acre to $90,000 an acre or $30,000, was that appreciation or was that inflation?
Appreciation.
Probably not, probably mostly of inflation.
Well, you know, we're talking about Catherine being in the dairy business. Very few dairymen in Florida ever made money selling milk. They made money selling land. I don't think T.G. Lee probably made much money selling milk, but he sure made a lot of money when his dairy became Colonial Plaza. And then the next dairy he bought out there next to the airport. So a good dairyman is able to buy land where it's in the path of progress.
So if you think about that, you think about we had a Governor Graham, Bob Graham, and his family was in the dairy business in Miami. And so they sold their first dairy, moved north, sold their second dairy, moved north again. They kept every time urbanization pushed up against them, they sold and moved out again. So those concentric rings of growth happen. They've happened right up the 95 corridor. They've happened in the Miami-Dade City, Lauderdale area. The only constraining factor there are the Everglades. It's happened in Orlando, the concentric rings of growth. So the important thing is getting the roads in early. And as Adam Putnam said, Fred and Ethel, they're coming to Florida. They have shoveled snow for their career, and they've got a good retirement in New York, and they're coming to Florida.
There's no state income tax, and you get $25,000 homestead exemption.
And
come on down.
And they've had a compensation package because of the high cost of living in these northern urban areas. Their compensation package was well in excess of a comparable compensation package in Florida. So they're coming down here with a nice retirement, probably much nicer than people who have stayed in Florida and come up through the same time period. So they're actually out competing the locals for services, for real estate, for housing, for cars.
But you know, David, one thing that's kind of interesting to me is that with all the people moving into Florida over the years, agriculture still was able to, quote, hold its own. You know, when Disney came, the world said that Orange County is going to disappear from agriculture. And it didn't happen. There was still a lot of citrus grown in Orange County, a huge amount of citrus grown in Lake County. The reason that citrus went away was not because of urbanization, but it was because of the freezes. And the generation that had the groves didn't realize that you should put money away, you know. Right. The second generation that lived in Cincinnati kept getting a check from the co-op. And all of a sudden one year the co-op says, hey, we can't send you a check this year. The groves froze, but if you send us $6,000 an acre, we'll replant that for you.
Right.
They said, $6,000 an acre? What do you mean? We don't have that money. What option did they have?
Yeah.
They sold it.
So I still remember my economics professor talking about the 4 phases of business. You have the infant, where you own the technology, the patents, and you're creating the market. You have the juvenile, where you still own the patents and the technology, and you've created the market, and it's very profitable. Then you have the adult, which is equity follows return. Equity follows return across all markets, across all countries. Equity follows return. So people have seen the money you've made. They're moving into your industry. You can't prevent them because you've lost your patents or your protection. And then you have the geriatric. And the geriatric is when it all becomes a commodity. Now you can extend these phases as an industry by being wise, or you can shorten them by weather events or economic events. But those are the 4 phases of business, and you just have to figure out. Very fortunate people are the ones that get in on the juvenile, the infant or juvenile, and help create an industry, and then enjoy that. And but they better have an exit strategy, or they better have under current tax laws prior to the Trump tax bill, estate tax took a lot of the equity out of family businesses at every generation. When every generation passed away, estate taxes took a lot of equity out. So you had to have a plan to recover, and thankfully the industry was growing, and you could grow faster than what you were having to pay Uncle Sam. But I'm sure all citrus families, all agricultural families have paid huge amounts over the years, huge amounts of estate tax, which really it's very difficult. Now there's ways to avoid that, but it's expensive to employ them.
Yep, we're losing the large agricultural families, and we're seeing the corporations and everything.
Right.
Well,
and that's one of the protections. You have to become a corporation for liability purposes and for organizational purposes. And the question is, do you want to be a S corp, a C corp, an LLC, or an LLP? I mean, there are a lot of tools.
It's going a different direction.
Right.
Well, Davey, we've developed our exit strategy, and our exit strategy, after a while, we finally run out of gas.
Okay.
I'm going to give you the current. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it.
Okay.
And this is the kind of oral histories that make our website rather unique. I'm really proud of the ones that we have.